there? My babies are gone. What's going on, ma'am? Oh my God! Ma'am, I can't understand you. You're going to have to slow down, calm down, and talk to me. What is going on? Somebody came in while I was sleeping. Me and my little boys were sleeping downstairs. Dad, my baby. Dad, I woke up. I was crying. We ran out to the garage. They're not dead. My babies are dying. They're dead. Oh my God.
June 6th, 1996, Rowlett, Texas. Having fallen asleep with her two sons while watching TV in the living room, Darlie Routier is startled awake by a man in her home. As the man flees, Darlie realizes that she and her children have been attacked and are in desperate need of medical attention. She screams for her husband before frantically calling 911, but unfortunately both boys would succumb to their injuries as Darlie was rushed into emergency surgery. An investigation was launched and police were determined to find out who had taken the lives of these two sweet innocent boys. But what no one expected was who would be found responsible for having carried out this horrible crime. This is the Darlie Routier story. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime cases each week. Last week we talked about the very bizarre disappearance of Kevin Jackson. If you haven't already, I urge you to check out that video. I will make sure to have it linked up here in the card for you. And if you just have an interest in true crime in general like me and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Before we get started, just a fair warning that today's story is extremely difficult as it involves the murder of two very small children. If that's not something that you think you can handle right now, please do not watch this video. Do what is best for you, and if that's finding something different to watch right now, I completely understand, and I'm sure that I will catch you back here very soon for a different story. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Today, we're talking about Darlie Routier. Ever heard of her? Well, if not, strap in, because this story's a doozy. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4th, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, to her parents Darlie Key and Larry Peck. However, Darlie's parents' marriage would ultimately end in divorce, which landed her in Texas with her mother and her stepfather. In 1985, when Darlie was just 15 years old, her mother set her up on a date with the assistant manager of the Western Sizzler where she was currently working. Saucy, right? Darlie's mother was super excited about the setup because 17-year-old Darren Routier was incredibly mature and responsible for his age. She expected that the two would hit it off and casually date for a while, but she never could have expected the immediate connection that Darren and Darlie would form. They had their first date later that same night and were pretty much inseparable from that point on. They officially tied the knot about 3 years later in August of 1988. Darlie was 18, just shy of 19, and Darren was 20. Once the couple was married, they moved to Rowlett, Texas, which is located about a half hour outside of Dallas. They settled in, and Darren very quickly built up a successful electronics company, which catapulted the newlyweds into a pretty nice life. By 1995, Darren was making close to $300,000 a year, which in today's money is about $525,000 a year, so, I mean, they were comfy. They built a nice big house, they bought fancy cars, they went on luxurious vacations. I mean, they were really just living their best damn life. Darlie also invested in some physical enhancements for herself, which you might be wondering why the hell I felt like it was necessary to bring that up, but just wait, because it is. But for now, just know that Darren and Darlie were happy. They were successful, and of course, they were oh so blissfully in love. So naturally, they decided to build on that love and expand their family. The couple had 3 children, Devin in 1989, Damon in 1991, and Drake in 1995. Darlie was a doting and fun-loving mother. She stayed home with the boys while Darren's company comfortably supported their lifestyle. From the outside looking in, it seemed as though the Routiers were living a pretty perfect life. That is, until June 6th, 1996. School was out, Summer vacation had begun, and to celebrate, Darlie promised her two oldest boys, Devin, who was 6 at the time, and Damon, who was 5 at the time, that they could have a sleepover in their living room. This was a mutually beneficial arrangement because Darlie's 8-month-old baby Drake had not been sleeping very well recently. Therefore, Darlie had not been sleeping well recently. So this living room sleepover would hopefully give her a night away from the baby to get some more restful sleep. Darlie and her boys stayed up late watching TV until eventually they all fell asleep. While they slept in the living room, Darren and baby Drake slept upstairs. Darlie later explained that she had fallen asleep, but that she was woken by her son Damon trying to cry out for her. However, she noted that his voice was very strained. She then claimed that she felt a knife to her throat as she began to struggle with an assailant. Before she could even really process what was happening, her attacker ran through the kitchen and out of the house through the garage, with Darlie hot on his trail. And as he ran out, the attacker was a man. Did I say that? Well, if not, white man, 6 foot, dark jeans, baseball hat, you know. Anyway, Darlie specifically remembered that as he ran through the house, the man knocked a wine glass off of a rack as she rushed after him. However, she was unable to catch up with him before he was gone through their utility room and out through the garage. But Darlie noticed that he had dropped the knife, which upon seeing, she picked up. She then turned around and saw that her son Devin was laying face up and bleeding profusely. In response, she screamed for Darren, who later stated that he had already kind of started waking up because he had also heard the glass break. He ran down the steps and straight into absolute chaos. Darlie was injured, frantic, and disoriented, and his children were both obviously very critically injured as well. Darren began CPR on Devin while Darlie called 911. Obviously, as you heard at the beginning of this video, Darlie was completely frantic and absolutely hysterical during that phone call. She was on the phone for just under 6 minutes when the paramedics arrived, and when they did, unfortunately, Devin had already succumbed to his 2 incredibly deep stab wounds to the chest. Stab wounds so deep, mind you, that they had actually nicked the concrete under the carpet where he'd been laying. But miraculously, Damon was still clinging to life despite having been stabbed 6 times. And Darlie herself had a near-fatal slash across her throat. Had her wound extended 2 more millimeters, it would have cut her carotid artery, and Darlie would have been dead in less than 20 seconds. She also had a gash on her right arm that was so deep that her bone was exposed. She was placed in an ambulance and taken to the hospital for emergency surgery. Darren tried to accompany Darlie to the hospital, but the paramedics wouldn't let him in the ambulance, so he showed up to the hospital separately shortly after Darlie. Damon, unfortunately, passed away in the ambulance before the paramedics could even get him to the hospital. The boys were laid to rest together on June 9th, 1996, and they were buried holding hands in the same casket. How gut-wrenching is that? This shook the community to its core. Murders were not a common occurrence in this area, let alone a murder this horrific. And these officers knew that it was their responsibility to piece together what had happened and bring the responsible party to justice. Which brings us to the investigation, which was weird kinda right away. When detectives asked Darren if he could think of anyone who might want to do this, he told them that it could be anyone because his wife was a good-looking blonde with big boobs. So I guess in his mind, this made her an obvious target for an attack of this nature. But contrary to what Darren seemed to believe, police actually started to feel suspicious of Darlie. Her version of events just did not seem to be matching up to the story that was being painted by the evidence that was gathered from the home. Not to mention that minor details of that story would change throughout the course of the investigation, but let's take things one step at a time and go over the evidence first. We'll start from the outside and work our way in. Now, the only piece of physical evidence that was found outside of the home was a sock that was speckled with Devin and Damon's blood. It was located about 75 yards away from the home in an alleyway near some trash cans. Initially, it appeared as though the sock had been dropped or ditched by the intruder as he'd fled, and as police searched the area around the home, they determined that said intruder must have entered and exited the home through a window in the garage that had had the screen cut. But this theory was later complicated when they found a bread knife of the Routiers that had fibers consistent with those that made up the window screen caught in the serrated portion of the blade. This led them to believe that someone in the house was actually responsible for having cut the screen. And when this was paired with the fact that the dust on the windowsill inside the garage was undisturbed, police felt all but certain that no one had actually crawled in or out of that window at any point. Darren would later demonstrate to detectives that it was entirely possible for someone to get in and out of the garage through that window without disturbing the dust, but they never wavered from their belief that the screen had only been cut in an effort to substantiate Darlie's story. It's been argued that the fibers on the bread knife were actually a result of cross-contamination from when the knife was fingerprinted. Like, the window screen was dusted and then the knife was dusted, which transferred particles from the window screen to the knife, and that the bread knife was actually completely unrelated to the events that had taken place that night. But something that was definitely related to the events that took place June 6th was obviously the knife used to murder Devin and Damon. The white-handled butcher knife had also come from the Routier's own kitchen knife block, which raised the question of who goes into a home with the intention of killing everyone there, but to do so just relies on whatever weapon they may be able to find lying around when they get there. Probably no one. So that didn't look good for Darlie's story either. The blood evidence in the home also did nothing to help corroborate Darlie's story, and there was plenty of it to analyze. The house was covered in blood. I mean, it was everywhere. In Darlie's original story, she had run after the attacker as he'd run out, and in his haste, he'd broken a glass from the Routier's wine rack. But in actuality, Darlie's blood was found underneath the glass, which forensically would suggest that Darlie's blood had already been on the floor prior to the glass falling and breaking. And this wouldn't be possible if the glass had fallen as Darlie had run after an attacker, like she'd stated. Not to mention that there was actually a safety mechanism on the wine rack, which was actually meant to keep glasses from falling off of the rack in the event that it was bumped. So how did this one glass manage to get over that safety mechanism and fall and break? Another issue with Darlie's story was that all of the blood evidence seemed to stop at the utility room, which led to the garage. If the attacker had fled taking that exact route out of the house, why was there no blood in the utility room, in the garage, or anywhere on the surrounding property? There also wasn't much blood on the couch, which is where Darlie had originally claimed that she was attacked, which...
That's weird.
If your throat is slashed and you're struggling with an assailant, you would expect to see blood where that had supposedly taken place, right? But that just wasn't the case. On the flip side of that, one area of the house where there was a lot of blood that didn't make sense was in and around the sink. This was weird because it was somewhere that Darlie had never mentioned being that night. During the 911 call and during her initial statements, she never mentioned spending any time at the sink. When asked about this, she explained that she actually had been at the sink that night because she was wetting towels to bring over to Damon to put on his wounds. But none of the officers that were there that night remember seeing towels on or even near Damon. And there was no diluted blood anywhere that would indicate that a wet, dripping towel had been carried from the sink to the living room or that water had even been introduced to the scene at all. And another thing that kind of had cops like... was that the sink actually looked as though it had been cleaned up slightly. So investigators sprayed the area with luminol to see if there had been additional blood there at one point, and sure enough, the whole area just lit the fuck up, which indicated to them that blood had in fact been cleaned up from the sink area prior to them arriving on scene. Obviously, during Darlie's story, no one had stopped at any point during all of this chaos to tidy up around the sink area and destroy evidence. But playing devil's advocate, what good would it do for Darlie to clean up anything, even if she had staged the scene? You would think it would be in her best interest for the scene to be as bloody and as brutal as possible, especially with her own blood. The more of her blood that was around the scene, the worse her injuries would have looked. Therefore, the more likely it would have been that she could not have self-inflicted them. So I don't think the fact that the sink had been wiped down really helps one side more than the other. I could be wrong. Maybe they thought that Darlie stood over the sink to inflict her own wounds and then wanted to clean up some of the blood to kind of conceal that fact, but I don't know. I do know that something that was very incriminating that the investigators discovered was what would be explained as cast-off blood from the boys on Darlie's nightshirt. Not transfer, cast off, as in cast off of an object and not transferred from her, like, tending to them. This cast-off was explained as being consistent with Darlie kneeling over the boys as she stabbed them. In particular, a spot of Devin's blood on the back of Darlie's shirt was consistent with her having raised a bloody knife up and over her head before thrusting it back down. That's how investigators believed that this one spot of blood in particular had found its way onto the back of Darlie's shirt. I mean, there was so much evidence that really did seem to incriminate Darlie, but at the same time, there was so much evidence that just didn't make any sense. Like that goddamn sock. What was that sock even used for, or supposed to look like it was used for? How did it end up outside? It had both of the boys' blood on it, so obviously it was put there after the attack. But if that was the case, how did no additional blood evidence end up outside? There's also an issue with, if Darlie had staged the scene, how much time she would have had to actually do all of these things, but we'll kind of get into that later. Unfortunately for Darlie, the only thing that really seemed to corroborate her story, definitively pointing to an unidentified person having been in the home at any point that night, was a bloody fingerprint recovered from a glass table that did not match Darlie, did not match Darren, did not match Devin, did not match Damon, and did not match Drake. Outside of all that, just brain-melting and conflicting-ass evidence. Investigators also placed a lot of emphasis on Darlie's affect and verbiage in her 911 call. They were extremely suspicious of how Darlie seemed to fixate on the knife and how she'd picked up the knife and how, oh my gosh, I could have potentially ruined evidence. They saw this less as concern for the integrity of the evidence and more as Darlie preemptively explaining why her fingerprints were on the murder weapon. However, I don't personally perceive it this way when Darlie talks about having picked up the knife and being worried that she ruined evidence. She was simply responding to the 911 dispatcher who had told her not to touch anything.
They left the knife laying in the... There's a knife, don't touch anything. I already touched it, picked it up. The knife was laying over there and I already picked it up. Okay, it's alright, it's okay. We got the print, baby.
But with that, I'm going to move on from the evidence. If you're interested, I highly encourage you guys to look into and do your own research on this case beyond this video, because there is so much information, and so much conflicting information at that I simply cannot go over everything in one video. I talked about a lot of the really big inconsistencies and really important pieces of evidence found throughout the course of the investigation, but I'll be the first to tell you that there is a lot that I have not and will not cover today. Bottom line is, the culmination of all the evidence, as well as Darlie's ever-changing stories and statements, led to her arrest on June 18th, 1996. She was charged with capital murder, and you guys, she was shocked. Neither she nor Darren really believed that she was a suspect or a person of interest, let alone that an arrest was coming down the pipeline. But you know who had a field day with Darlie's arrest? Was the media. As soon as they caught wind that Darlie had been arrested for her son's murders, they chewed her up, spit her out, raked her over the coals, threw her under the bus, backed it the hell over her. I mean, you name it, they did it. They were brutal. They even compared her to Susan Smith, and I have to say, I think the fact that Susan's whole case was so fresh in everyone's memories really hurt Darlie in the long run. Darlie's credibility as a grieving mother was also decimated by a video that was released to the public just 4 days before her arrest. On June 14th, Darren, Darlie, and some of their family members were videotaped holding a birthday party at the boys' grave to celebrate what would have been Devin's 7th birthday. Throughout the most famous and overplayed portion of this video, Darlie can be seen chewing gum, smiling, laughing, and spraying silly string on the children's grave. And the public, you guys, they were outraged and repulsed by this video. They found Darlie's behavior completely inappropriate and did not believe that she appeared as though she was a grieving mother. Rather, that she appeared to be celebrating the fact that her sons were gone. Darlie's family tried really hard to explain that there was more to the video, that the news had not played the parts of the video where the family was crying and praying and honoring the boys. Darlie herself even spoke out later about the video, stating, quote, "He wanted to be 7. I did the only thing I knew to do to honor him and give him all of his wishes because he wasn't here anymore. But how do you know what you're going to do when you lose 2 children? How do you know how you're going to act?" Unquote. But her and her family's efforts really didn't matter. The damage had been done. All Darlie could do was constantly and unwaveringly maintain her innocence. Even as Darlie was crying, being escorted by police, she was badgered by the press for a statement, to which she responded, "I'm innocent. I did not kill my children." Darlie's trial began exactly 7 months after the night of the attacks on January 6th, 1997, which is fast, right? In my opinion, it seems fast. For a capital murder trial, these things usually take way longer to prepare for. On top of that, Darlie even had a change in representation just weeks before the trial started. Her first defense attorney really wanted to try and pin the murders on Darren, but Darlie refused to do so, and this disagreement actually led her to seek new counsel. But even with the fact that Darlie got a new attorney, effectively flushing all the work that had been done on her defense up to this point down the toilet, the trial proceeded as planned. It was held 5 hours away from Rowlett in Kerrville, Texas. Obviously, this was done in an effort to put distance between the jury and the outrageous media coverage that this case had garnered. The prosecution's narrative was that Darlie had murdered her sons because the family was experiencing financial troubles. They described her as a materialistic woman who feared that her lavish lifestyle was coming to an end. During this argument, they really fixated on Darlie's boobs. Remember those? Yeah, they're back. They insisted that because she had breast implants, she was materialistic, selfish, and money hungry, and that because she had no stab wounds to her chest area, that it was obvious she had inflicted her wounds in a way that would not mess up her breast implants. So just know, if you're thinking about getting breast implants, they can and will be used against you in a court of law. Ultimately, the prosecution suggested that Darlie had murdered the boys in order to collect their life insurance money. The defense argued that the amount that Darren and Darlie had received hadn't even covered the boys' funeral expenses. Therefore, they had walked away with no money from the crime. Darlie's attorney explained to the jury that there was actually no reason for Darlie to want to kill her children, and that without a motive, a confession, or any witnesses, it was unrealistic to accuse Darlie of murdering the children and staging the scene. The issue with the whole Darlie didn't have a motive argument was, what the hell was the motive for anyone else to do this? It certainly wasn't robbery because there were 13 rings and a gold watch sitting on the counter that were never touched. So why would someone just randomly come in off the street and do this? That theory didn't really seem to make much sense either. Therefore, the defense focused heavily on the bloody sock that had been found outside of the home. They argued that it proved that Darlie could not have committed the crime. You see, the medical examiner testified that Damon could have only survived about 8 minutes after receiving his injuries. And since he was still alive when paramedics had arrived on the scene, that Darlie simply would not have had enough time to inflict her own injuries, stage the crime scene, plant the sock outside the house, call 911, and then wait for paramedics to arrive. The prosecution countered that the medical examiner's stated survival time for Damon was just an estimation. They stood by the fact that the sock had been planted outside to support Darlie's theory that an intruder had fled from the scene. I have seen a theory float around that Darlie actually had to go back and stab Damon again after the first attack because he was still alive, and that maybe he sustained his more serious and ultimately fatal injuries the second time around, which might have provided Darlie with enough extra time to go outside and plant the sock. Like, she stabbed the boys, ran the sock outside, came in and realized he was still alive, stabbed him again, and that's when the 8 minutes would have started. But that brings me back to, why is there no blood evidence outside? But also, if an attacker had dropped the sock outside, there would probably still be blood evidence outside. See, this is a perfect example of how researching and reading about this case felt. Every piece of information and every possibility opens up new questions and brings up new things that don't make sense, and it will just make your head spin the more and more you look into it. Another big point of contention during the trial was Darlie's wounds. A medical examiner for the defense testified that the injury to Darlie's neck was not consistent with any self-inflicted wounds he had ever seen before. But the prosecution argued that her treating physicians had told police that her wounds very well could have been self-inflicted. Who's to say? Despite being advised not to, Darlie did testify on her own behalf, which is usually a terrible idea and did go terribly for her. She came across as defensive and argumentative before she just completely fell apart during her cross-examination. The prosecution also played the silly string video for the jury, which we already know people did not respond well to. Just like the public, the jurors were not shown the portion of the video where the family was crying and mourning for the boys. And during their 7-hour deliberation, the jury actually asked to see the silly string video upwards of 10 times. And it really must have had an impact on them because they ultimately found Darlie Routier guilty of murdering her 2 sons. And on February 4th, 1997, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Aside from the smear campaign the media crusaded against Darlie, one of the things that I think hurt Darlie the most was the lack of forensic experts that her team had called to testify on her behalf. Darlie's initial defense attorney had had forensic experts lined up, but because he wanted to shift the blame onto Darren, he was let go, and Darlie's new defense attorney did not retain any of those experts. He also didn't seem to find it important to secure his own, so I don't know. I do know that there are a lot of mixed opinions on whether the jury got it right with this one. Hell, some of the actual jury members don't even know if they got it right. After hearing about the parts of the silly string video that they hadn't seen, some of the jurors said they wished they'd had the opportunity to see the whole video before making their decision. So, do I think Darlie's innocent? I don't know, I wasn't there. But do I think the prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt? I sure don't, because even after going through everything I could possibly find about this case, I still feel like there's enough room for doubt to creep in. Darlie's mother, her sister, and Darren still remain her biggest supporters. Darren, in particular, has always been very outspoken about his belief that Darlie is innocent. Despite their divorce in 2011, Darren still remains supportive of Darlie and still believes that she was wrongfully convicted. There is a theory that Darren actually hired someone to carry out this attack because he's admitted to trying to stage a burglary in the past in order to collect on insurance money. So people are kind of like, if he'd do that for money, where exactly is the line for him, you know? But I'll link an article that covers that theory in the description box down below, because that is like a whole other subsection that I just cannot get into in this video. So, moving on, Darlie's youngest and only surviving son is also supportive of his mother. He's maintained a relationship with her over the years and regularly visits her in prison. On July 25th, 2001, Darlie filed her first appeal, but it was denied in 2003. Also, in 2003, new DNA testing for a decent chunk of the evidence from the case was requested, but the request was denied in 2007. But then, plot twist, that denial was overturned, and the additional testing was approved on a portion of what had been initially requested, including the sock, the knife, a hat, Darlie's shirt, a pair of jeans, pillows and pillowcases, blankets, a placemat, and the fingerprint, which had been basically ignored during the trial. But as of the summer of 2019, that additional testing had not been completed, and I couldn't find anything to suggest that it has been since then, so I guess don't hold your breath for those results. The Innocence Project of New York has also expressed their support for Darlie and has actually teamed up with her appeals team, which is huge. They don't just take on any old case. They only take on cases with convictions that they're fairly certain they can overturn. But even with that, at this point, Darlie Routier still remains incarcerated on death row at the Mountain View unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to this day. Again, I don't know if she's innocent or not, but I think there's just as good of a chance that she is as there is that she isn't. And I mean, this is like a really polarizing debate. There's people that are hardcore Darlie's guilty, set an execution date, and there are people who are just as hardcore supportive of her innocence. And then there's me, smack dab in the middle. The only thing I can say with complete confidence is that I do not think that her execution should be carried out anytime soon. There is just too much room for doubt. I'm also not like a huge proponent of the death penalty. I think there's times when it's appropriate, but I also think it's dramatically overused in our country. So there's my 2 cents. Don't come for me. But do head down to the comments and let me know what you think. Which side do you fall on? Do you think she's guilty or do you think she's innocent? And let's remember what truly matters here. 2 sweet, innocent little boys lost their lives that night, and whether Darlie is responsible or not, they deserve honest and true justice, not just someone to blame. So let's end on that note. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.